And we just received a message that the LinkedIn gremlins are apparently at work, and so there are some technical difficulties tied to those individuals who are looking to join us with via LinkedIn. And as it is a Friday night, and it's always a case of where Murphy's Law seems to always afflict us on a Friday night, then we consider that to be standard fare. But everybody who's joined us via YouTube, thank you very much for joining. And our subject, of course, as I've mentioned earlier, this is all tied to looking at the legislation and how we use governance to better manage our supply chains, looking at a sustainable supply chain. And I have three stellar panelists with me today. And so perhaps if I can go in the order that it actually shows up on the screen for me, perhaps Sophia, if you can briefly go ahead and introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone, and really nice to be here again, as usual, in the discussion with Mike and the others. Who am I? I'm an industry, not veteran yet, but 20 years is enough. And I'm freelancing in terms of supply chain management and try to help startups and small and medium-sized enterprises, sometimes bigger corporations, again, to sustainability proof their supply chain to use this absolutely I don't know buzzword as may. So yeah, basically the whole point for me to be here is to ensure that, you know, from an industry perspective and from a small scale enterprise perspective, we look at those requirements that they meet and they will be hit by, and how will they tackle it? What are those gaps that I see already where they will have problems potentially, and how we could help them overcome these. And very happy to have the others here with their perspective. It will also help me in the process. Thank you.
And we don't want to neglect the others, of course. Perhaps, Joseph, you can give a description of yourself.
Hello, everybody. This is my first time here, so I really don't know what to expect. I'm familiar with, of course, with Zoom and a bunch of other ones, but this is the first time I'm on SteamYard. So it's a pleasure being here. I think it's in Vienna or somewhere in Central Europe that I'm here. I'm a professor at the Worcester Polytechnic Institute. It's spelled Worcester, but it's pronounced Worcester. We also go by WPI, the acronym, the three-letter acronym as well. My area of work has been for many years in the areas of operations, decision-making, technology management, and eventually supply chain management. And I mention eventually because supply chain management evolved from operations and marketing and logistics and transportation and so on. And my work, my research work, my writings have in the past couple decades, but going back 3 decades, before that I was doing other stuff, but primarily in the last 2 or 3 decades have been primarily on environmental issues in supply chain management, which eventually became green supply chain management, which eventually became sustainable supply chain management. And I use those terms synonymously and interrelatedly. I change them as the audience perspective. And I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Wonderful. Maybe I might even go ahead and throw in an additional term. Let's call it regenerative supply chain. What do you think, Gabriela? Welcome. Thank you very much for joining. Perhaps if you can go ahead and give us a little bit of information on yourself.
Hello, I'm Gabriela. I'm based in Germany, in Berlin. Yeah, all the different supply chains. Sometimes I even heard responsible supply chain or those ones. I myself, I'm from when it comes to supply chain, from the procurement side of the supply chain. I've been working in the industry, in private sector, in procurement position, and also at the public sector in procurement position, and had the chance to work with different NGOs, organizations like WWF, the Climate Kick, the EU, different DGs on sustainable / green / responsible / innovative, all the different procurement projects they had. And recently I had the chance to be involved in different circular economy and circular supply chain procurement projects as well. And I really hope that I can contribute to the discussion. Yeah, myself, I have a legal background, so I am graduated in laws, in environmental law, and then later in human rights. So this is actually how I ended up in this field of sustainable supply chain and procurement. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And we've running across some technical issues apparently from LinkedIn, what I understand, but of course the show must go on, and so it will. And perhaps maybe some general ground rules that for those of you who are not familiar, I believe in making sure that our sessions are very interactive. So that means for all of the panelists, if there's something that you would like to go ahead and to say to maybe some other comments that were made, feel empowered to go ahead and jump in. And we're very keen on making sure that that dialogue is flowing. And then, of course, for our audience, so I'm looking here, there you are. Our goal is, of course, to make this as interactive as possible, also from the audience perspective. So if there's anything that's being said, or perhaps even what's not being said from our panelists, feel empowered to go ahead and put some information into the chat box, and we will make sure that you are part of this conversation. So perhaps maybe to get things started, maybe if I could start with you, Joseph, there were some documents that you put out recently that I thought were quite interesting, especially looking at the use of technology as a means by which we establish a sustainable supply chain. And of course, there's always that question of how we go ahead and define these terms. And if we look at technology like blockchain as a means by which we actually guarantee our outcomes, or in the best case scenario, how does that actually play into the traditional legal approaches that we take to make sure that governance is managed on a public policy perspective?
Okay. Yeah, I was looking over some of the materials and so on. You're located in Central Europe, and as many of you know, or if you don't know, it's probably been in the news. There's been various laws that have been passed. One in France a couple of years ago, one recently in Germany over the past summer, and they're being considered by the EU. And this law that is being passed is called the Due Diligence Law, that companies of a certain size and scope need to effectively, efficiently, and with good faith take care of any issues that they observe and or maybe not observe, but any issues that occur in their supply chain. And they could be anywhere in the supply chain. Now, one of the difficulties of being able to determine what's going on in your supply chain is being able to look into your supply chain. And the supply chain is very complex. When you go down one tier, a lot of big major companies, especially these companies that fit within the scope, have to consider maybe thousands of different suppliers. Now, these hundreds and thousands of suppliers to these big companies also have hundreds and maybe even thousands of suppliers there. Some of them, of course, interchange and they come in and out. But eventually, the network can get into tens of thousands, maybe even a million different suppliers when you go multiple tiers down the supply chain. Now, you're responsible for a lot of that as a big company, and that's what the law says. Now, one of the difficulties is how do you get the visibility to see all of that? Well, some technologists, some seers of the future, some sustainability and some supply chain researchers are saying blockchain is one way of doing this. Now, blockchain has a certain series of capabilities that allow you to look deep into the supply chain, or what I like to say, it's a multi-stakeholder technology that allows multiple participants from throughout a group to be able to be involved in the sharing of information. Now, the sharing of information, making sure the information is reliable, trustworthy, and you know where it's coming from, has provenance, is critical to this visibility and transparency argument. Now, why is visibility and transparency important? Because you then have a way of monitoring what's going on. Things will not pop up as a surprise. If you're looking down 2, 3, 4 tiers into your supply chain and you don't have a way of doing it and you have to trust that what's going on at the lower levels and you are liable for that trust, that gets into a whole governance issue. Blockchain can help build that trust theoretically. This is the hope and the promise of blockchain technology, that you get secure, easily accessible, traceable, and transparent information in an efficient way is the promise. And that is what the sales pitch is for using blockchain to help in the supply chain governance issues. Of course, how does it relate to sustainability? Well, you don't know if actors in the supply chain are good actors from an environmental perspective, good actors from a social perspective, or not. But if you had a system where you could trust the data to gather data that provides trust that what they are doing is sustainable or not sustainable, because you could also use it to identify problem areas and improve those problem areas. It doesn't mean you should hide everything. You should make it open if you want to try to improve. That's the other side of why this information is valuable. But this is essentially information to govern the supply chain in a different way than it's done previously. So not only is it your supply chain that you have as a blockchain, but supposedly there's multiple supply chains that interact with this supply chain. And a theoretical situation is everyone in the supply chain has some kind of level of visibility through the blockchain. Of course, there's different types of blockchain and different characteristics and so on, but that's the general idea of how potentially this technology can help in sustainability of the supply chain, its governance, and meeting regulatory requirements. Oh, back to the regulatory requirements, one more aspect of that is if you do have the blockchain, you are doing something. Part of these regulations are saying you should do something to prevent problems from occurring. Having this transparency and visibility allows you one step, one approach to reduce or to, provide good faith effort to prevent problems. And I think I'll stop there. That's my brief overview introduction.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that one, Joseph. I think if we look at it from a traditional perspective of how we establish legislation, the results that we expect, and a certain amount of control to be found within those auspices you mentioned here, some legislation that has come through here in Europe, and no doubt we will be talking about that a little bit more in detail. I might be wrong here, Gabriele, but I think that is kind of up your alley, if I got it right, and your thoughts of to what degree the powers in Brussels or conversely in the various capitals here in Europe, would they be willing to hand over such auspices to the technology? What's your take on that?
Yeah, thank you. It's very good follow up on that. Just maybe one quick comment on the supply chain law that Joseph just mentioned. Indeed, in Germany, we just have a new law since a couple of weeks, couple of months now. So it's a very new law, actually since end of June at the end. It concerns just not couple of companies, but just companies above a specific threshold. However, they just came out with a law, and they already said that the EU Commission and the EU Parliament, parallel, they're already working on an EU regulation, not even a directive, a regulation, to have a supply chain law for the whole EU as such. So we just have a new law here in Germany, but they're already communicating it in a way that in a couple of months' time, maybe in a year or so, it depends on the whole circles in the EU, the European Commission and European Parliament. There might be a new law with new elements, new articles. It might be even stronger. It might affect smaller sized companies as well. So it's an area of development, especially when it comes to this one specific legislation, supply chain due diligence law in Germany. And going back to your question, Michael, when it comes to the importance of technology, when I read, or when anybody reads these existing supply chain laws in Europe, France has one, UK, I would still mention UK in this regard, Germany now. You just read the text and you start to question yourself, yeah, but where is technology? Where is monitoring? Where are the necessary follow-ups in order to make sure that these laws are going to be respected and going to be implemented in the practice? So basically, I would say that the technology is very important, and it should be implemented and integrated into the laws, into the supply chain laws, by means of necessary and obligatory monitoring practices, specific KPIs that for that specific data has to be delivered. And in this case, I would say that it's not only about the supply chain laws, but also about the corporate sustainability reporting laws as well, because that's basically sort of like there is a linkage between monitoring and reporting about challenges and about the whole supply chain when it comes to environmental and social aspects, and about respecting those rules as well. Yeah, but when it comes to recent development in law, I wouldn't say that technology and the importance of technology such as blockchain and the whole technology behind is at this point would be taken into account into these laws.
No, and I would question to what degree the powers that be would be willing to hand over the key so easily. And I really question, and this is a tendency. Yeah, you're shaking your head in agreement. I'm going to take that as being in agreement,
Yeah.
Joseph. We see a clear tendency not only in Europe, but the trend in the United States is to perhaps be a little bit hesitant or suspect of some of the technology powers that we currently have. And I would be curious to get your opinion on this one, Sophia. To what degree can we use technology in a way that is truly neutral? And here is the last comment from my end. I worked in IT for a number of years, and I've worked on various open source projects. And as soon as the open source project was closed, everybody says, yes, is this open source? And they say, yes. And then you would have a company like Microsoft turn around and say, but we need our own flavor of XML or whatever it may be. So by nature, I really wonder how we avoid keeping these systems proprietary and making sure that they're not proprietary and keeping a handle on all that. And Sophia, I'm sure that you would you have some opinion on the subject as well.
Of course. Well, it's not an easy thing, right? Let's admit that upfront, that keeping the neutrality is never an easy thing. But I think if we really want to try, we can succeed there as well. It's a matter of trying and a matter of mentality. Where if we really look at just nature, I know it might be far-fetched for some people to, marry nature to technology or vice versa. But if we look at how nature operates and what are those systemic thinking and system setup that nature is using, then it's not that far from technology if we look at open source solutions. And getting back to the previous conversation about technology and blockchain. Blockchain is supposed to be that distributed ledger solution, right? That can help us really with the ownership being right there distributed between the actors of the supply chain. But at the same time, everybody has the opportunity to access the data and look at it and audit as such, right? So from a legislative perspective, that is actually one of those aspects that could serve us really well. and that range of actors along the supply chain and the stakeholders could really manage this well, right, from that perspective. So I think we have a really good chance here, Mike, and I don't think it's impossible. It's just we need to try, and before handing over to the big solution providers, we should really try managing this in a way that those small companies who are blockchain providers at the moment, they get each of them a chance to come up with solutions that are valuable. They can be linked together, and instead of creating a beast like Microsoft, I'm sorry, I need to mention them. I'm not against them. It's just really how they also grew. So instead of creating a monster, we could really just use open source innovation and open source technology, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think that you gave me a great opportunity, Sophia, to use this as a segue when we're really talking about the definitions, and I'm just kind of piggybacking you, Joseph, on some of the things that you mentioned earlier. If we agree that nature works on a steady state, there is no such thing as growth, and if we agree that sustainability is adhering to the steady state, that we say that resilience is making sure that we get back to the steady state, and if we say that regenerative means that it becomes continuum, which is actually the circularity, then the question would be, when we look at components, again looking from a technology perspective, the performance elements are easy. Anything that deals with economics, we could easily manage. But if we're really looking at the so-called meat and potatoes of what we really need to be looking at within the supply chain, I'm only piggybacking, Sophia, on what you were talking about, and that would be the social and the ecological. How do we quantify this in a way that it actually fits into zeros and ones? And who does the qualification? Because in those four terms that I just mentioned, I know there are too many people out there that have different definitions. Anybody care to give that a stab? I think that, Joseph, you're wetting at the bit here to actually answer the questions earlier.
Well, yeah, the whole issue of technology replacing government regulations, I don't think that should be the question. Is how do you use technology to help? It's a supporting thing, not a replacement thing. I don't think you can really replace the mandatory oversight that's necessary for organizations. Otherwise, they're going to do whatever it takes for them, whatever's beneficial to them. What I was saying from the technological perspective is that organizations, to show good faith in following these regulations, meeting these regulatory requirements, can use the technology to do that. The governance mechanism that they have, the regulatory mechanisms, the laws, are going to remain there. These technologies are not going to replace those. But technology is only one part of the picture, too. You have, and more importantly than technology is the users. The technology exists. We have all kinds of technology at our disposal. But what the users do with the technology is much more critical. Behavior is 99% of outcome, in my opinion. Human behavior is what's critical in this situation. Now, how do you govern human behavior? There's multiple ways of governing human behavior. Technology can set boundaries. It can support good behavior. It can also support bad behavior. People can find ways around anything. So as a technology person, I'm not one who says technology is the solution. As a matter of fact, I've written articles saying technology is not the solution to sustainability and can work against sustainability as well. But I've also taken the other side and saying it can also enable it if it's used in the right way. So I don't want to look at technology as being bad or good. For me, it's an inanimate object. It's how people use it that's going to be the most critical aspect of it. And that means people in the supply chain and how organizations use it. But there was many other things I wanted to touch upon that they mentioned. Was one of them, I think, that Gabriela mentioned in terms of reporting. Now, one of the issues, and this gets a little bit beyond the governance mechanisms of regulation, but more the governance mechanisms of the free market. And the free market supposedly works on information asymmetry reduction, information change, exchanges, and so on. And one of the mechanisms for this disclosure that investment companies and markets use is ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance mechanisms. And the other day I said, how can blockchain technology support ESG? And ESG can be used for multiple purposes. Usually it's associated with the investments, but governments can use it. You can, society can use it. NGOs can use this information. The problem with ESGs and sustainability reports and disclosure is that they're not standardized and they're not maintained well. Now the question is, can something like this multi-stakeholder technology like blockchain help with the auditability? Somebody mentioned auditability. Can it help with the reliability and trustworthiness of this information? So not only can you gather information to manage regulatory processes, but you can gather information through these technologies for investment purposes, for market purposes, for consumer purposes. And that's why I call it a multi-stakeholder technology, that the information is available to multiple sources for multiple purposes, even the same information. And I think this is where the power of blockchain technology is. Organizations can use this to provide the necessary information for all these governance mechanisms, whether they're voluntary, market governance, or regulatory governance.
Yeah, and thank you very much for coming up with the euphemism to describe greenwashing in another perspective. So that was very appreciated. Any thoughts from you, Gabriele, Sophia, and that of what Joseph just passed on? Please, Gabriele.
And just one thing to add, because Joseph was talking about gathering information, but we also need to gather information for new laws, for updated laws, for policies, actually that are the basis for later laws. So I would say that I really, when it comes, I've been working in a field of procurement, and especially when it comes to public procurement. And what I was always missing in public procurement legislation are mandatory reporting requirements. When it comes to private sector supply chain, obviously you might have a different law like the corporate sustainability reporting, and then might be some sort of mandatory mandatory reporting involved. But when it comes to the public sector, there is no such, or just a very basic requirement to report on specific facts. And without knowing what is going on, without knowing about the whole public sector supply chain issues, it's not even possible to draft better laws, to see what are the tipping points and how to address them, because we don't even have the information. And that's also one point for blockchain, not only to act on the recent laws, but to support future laws, I would say.
Yeah. Can I also add one more thing, Mike, here?
No, you can't.
Oh, okay. So just piggybacking on what Gabriela said about the public and private sector, reflecting a little bit on how to come up with better legislation, I think there is still a huge gap in asking private sector about input into different laws. And I know that there are certain public institutions who are trying, but I still see a huge gap there, which should be plugged in. And the other side of this story is still, I think, hopefully it was not so much a Freudian situation there, but when you drop the word voluntary, Gabriela, it immediately clicked for me that many of these legislations around sustainability have been for too long voluntary, right? Voluntary disclosure and nothing obligatory, right? Nothing, there was no obligation. There was no, kind of carrot and stick situation and causality linked to it, right? So from a legislative perspective, for me, that's nothing. I'm sorry, but that's one of those things where I would say, yes, many companies actually exploited those voluntary legislative requirements to their benefit to market their greenwashing or greenwishing ideas as sustainable solutions, right? So very much agree with both what Joseph and Gabriela said here.
And here I have to go back to something that I read today from you, Joseph, or your name was on the paper, and it was all tied to this idea that the legislation or policy could possibly be counterproductive in the respect of the reaction, and very possibly it might be tied to partially to that, Sophia, of what you're mentioning is that we do not have necessarily the enforcement mechanisms in place to allow us to make it happen. But it was some interesting insights. Perhaps you'd like to go ahead and talk about that, Joseph. Some of the research that you performed in looking at the adverse reaction to be found within certain companies based upon the policy that was being presented.
I don't remember which article that was. Again,
Doesn't matter. It was tied to innovation and use of technology as a way by which they could even the playing field. Because one of the comments that was made was that, okay, it's not just you being a multinational, but all of your competition is confronted with the same situation. So how do you deal with it? Looking at a classic Porter's five forces, where we have the competition in the middle of the diagram, fighting it out against each other. Well, how do you differentiate yourself with the competition, especially when you're all afflicted with this same regulation?
I think it's a good thing when everybody is afflicted with the same regulation. There's also the situation where there's a free rider situation. Now, European companies German companies, first of all, are ones who are facing legislation that other places in the world are not. And they're going to be pointing fingers saying, look, you're tying our hands here by making us do things that other organizations in other places do not allow us to do, or are allowed to do. Like if you're in the United States, it's a wide open world on sustainability and doing what you want to do, although there are certain rules and regulations that are in place, but it's mostly voluntary, information based. One of the things with these regulations that are beginning in Germany and that the EU may adopt, as I think Gabriela mentioned, is likely to adopt, and maybe I think Sophia mentioned it as well, is that they have teeth behind them. They're actually going to put money down and actually fine companies in the tens of millions, if not potentially hundreds of millions of dollars for something that goes wrong. This is the stick aspect of it. If you're going to make everything a carrot, then some companies are going to grab the carrot, especially those companies that have the tools and availability, that have the least, steep, the slope of the hill to get there is the lowest grade hill. The easiest to get there are those companies who are going to take advantage of the carrots. The other companies are not going to take advantage of it. They're going to be spending their time and effort somewhere else, trying to increase the return on investment. If the return on investment is in line with the regulations, they'll take advantage of that. If the return on investment is not in line with the regulations, they're going to go in a different direction. Unfortunately, even in sustainability, the stool leg that gets 99% of the attention is economics. We could talk all we want about environment and social good and all these different things, but without some internalizing the external costs of social, environmental, free goods, companies aren't going to do anything. And that's a basic economics principle. I'm not sure if I answered that question, but yeah, some companies will use technology to their competitive advantages. And one of the things that is a competitive advantage of some of these multi-stakeholder technologies is the efficiency, if it works. And again, there's a big if there. If it works, the efficiencies involved in gathering the information. A large reason why information isn't easily accessible isn't because companies are trying to hide it, but because it's so expensive to get right now. Blockchain and other technologies may reduce the cost of gathering that information, essentially requiring their suppliers and their suppliers' suppliers to provide that information if they want business. And they might have that information easily accessible. So there's those issues. And I think, Mike, when I was talking about the differences and taking advantage of it and having them take advantage of this information, it was more from a competitiveness perspective. If they implement blockchain, it can be more competitive. I think that's That's where I'll stop right there.
Oh, no, that's fine. Joseph, I was just trying to wind you up a little bit, and it looks like I succeeded.
Oh, I
But
can wind up in many different ways. I'm
no,
easily
that's
wound.
fine. Now we're trying to come up with an interesting discussion. I almost felt that you were bringing us into a great segue into a CO2 tax. But I'd like to go ahead and ask Gabriele and Sophia a question before we go down that road. Just kind of piggybacking on that of what Joseph was talking about. Do we have teeth within the EU to truly enforce those things that we are trying to push through? What are your thoughts? Sophia?
I think we are lacking teeth. Let's
That was
put it
very
this way.
definitive. No, that was quite clear, and I would not disagree with you. Gabriele, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would. I wouldn't disagree either. But just wait for the first draft. We will see how the first draft of the regulation looks like, and it's important for everybody to know that regulations, if the EU is coming with a regulation, it's directly applicable in the countries, in all the EU countries. So it doesn't have to be amended into the national legislation. So if there is any EU regulation on supply chain, it will be valid from Finland to Portugal, everywhere in the same extent.
Yeah, and certainly it makes it much easier once we attempt to regulate elements within the EU per se, then at least there's a certain amount of leverage available. And in fact, perhaps maybe by looking at these things from the internal perspective, that indeed has an effect on the external. That was the whole idea of GDPR. We haven't heard much of that subject lately, but I mean, let's be honest. I tend to think, considering my origins, I still like to think that the glass is half full, and so let's go ahead and hope for the best. I'd like to go ahead and make sure that we give our audience an opportunity to toss in their 2 cents, and this is coming from Balish. So thank you very much, Balish, for engineering everyone to come to YouTube since there was a crash on LinkedIn. We have laws for emissions. Then we delegate production to China where such laws aren't applied. We kill our economy, hurt nature too. Joseph, this is partially what you were talking about. Will these supply chain laws be different using common sense? Whoa, that's another term that I didn't include in my definitions earlier, common sense, but maybe that's something we should look at. And any thoughts from any of you tied to that of what Balish was asking?
Just
Sophia?
go ahead. I see you that you want
All
to
right.
say something,
Oh
and
yeah,
I'm gonna
I've
follow
done
up.
work. I've done work in China. As a matter of fact, a lot of my publications have been with green supply chains in China and so on. Yeah, I agree. There's been mixed economic results, but common sense does say that companies will locate to places where there's easier places where these externalities are not internalized to organizational costs. And this is also called the pollution haven hypothesis, that companies will locate to wherever the environmental regulations are the easiest to get around. I don't say that where the environmental regulations don't exist. China has probably the most environmental regulations in the world. The issue there is the enforcement. Do they really enforce those regulations? There's a lot of looking the other way. And yes, companies will look that way. Supposedly, and now this gets back to the assumption that there is real teeth, there is real monitoring, and there is real auditing of this, and real fines and real court cases. If there is real teeth, companies will more carefully examine the pollution haven hypothesis. That is, will they actually go? It would be very interesting, and this is from a researcher perspective, to study that once this goes into force, and I think there's a certain date when it's going into force and so on for a broader set, will companies do more reshoring or bringing back to where they're located? Will the pollution haven hypothesis no longer be as valid as it was before these laws? That would be an interesting perspective. But in this case, it isn't the suppliers or it isn't finding suppliers in China. It's more about companies locating their facilities in China. I don't know if that's considered a supply chain or not. So that's where the pollution haven. They will relocate to somewhere else. But finding suppliers in different parts of the world, that's a little more complex. But will suppliers get cleaner in other countries, cleaner from a number of dimensions, social dimensions, environmental dimensions, is one of the things we should be investigating. Are these laws really effective? I don't know what the answer is. This is very early on. And I agree with Gabriela and Sophia that yes, there's a lot of uncertainty and companies don't know. And right now there's a lot of skepticism about whether these laws are going to be effective or not. But it really depends on what the lawmakers decide to do in terms of enforcement. And the other part of this is, what do those countries in other places that do not have these laws, are they going to have an equal agreement that they will allow this to occur? And now the other side of this is, will you see headquarters shifting from Germany in the EU to China in the United States because of these laws? Because it represents German companies and it represents French companies and EU companies. You could just change the headquarters. Will there more be offshoring or reshoring occurring? I think this is a very amazing situation where this change really is going to cause to find out if there is going to be a difference. You can see either side.
You have a clear precedence already with GDPR, precisely, Joseph, from that of what you were talking about, because we saw precisely those movements that you just referred to. We saw that in lieu of GDPR coming into place in the end of May 2018, and we still see some movement taking place. Although interestingly enough, it becomes a case of where the tail wags the dog, and that's another point that we need to take into consideration. That we even have there's a law in California that's to a certain degree even more stringent than GDPR. I don't want to go too much in that direction, but I cannot avoid that segue into a CO2 tax, because it goes directly into that of what you were talking about, Joseph. If we go ahead and establish a tax at the border, at an EU border of 500 million people, where we know for a fact that number has a very significant role, looking at it from an economic perspective, that would be extremely powerful. And with that, I would be very keen to get Gabriele and Sophia's opinion on that statement. Either one. Sophia, it looked like you were ready to go.
You go ahead, Gabi, or yeah. I can go ahead. Okay, so basically from my perspective, from a very industrial point of view, that is very risky. That is very risky, but at the same time, as I always say, if we don't move at least with a bigger block together, it will never ever materialize, and we need to take that chance, right? Whether we like it or not. And the other segment for me here comes in play, where I would say CO2 tax cannot go ahead without company income tax legislation changes, right? So whoever has a headquarter here or there needs to pay taxes there. Of course, everybody is aware of also the great work coming from Janet Yellen, basically, in terms of harmonizing, company revenue taxation. That needs to go hand in hand, and in that case, that can balance a little bit out, not much, but a little bit. And at the same time, again, getting back to what Joseph said, tax haven from this perspective, or even from a pollution perspective, is that really something that's a solution? I think also the customers will at one point vote with their money. At least from what I see from a European point of view, I started seeing the trend from a consumer perspective, where they actively go against companies who are not taking the relevant steps, which I'm very happy to see. So I would say also in the US, even if there is an imbalance, or in Asia, that honeymoon period will not be so long, because consumers will get more and more conscious, and I hope that will also push that balance a little bit back into what we should be doing, right? The right thing to do. So it's not just down to the companies or who's cheating or who's not cheating with relocating, but rather, can we get to a point where we really say, are we doing the right thing? Do we have the understanding that this is not just about company revenue or profitability or shareholder revenue, but about the fact that even the shareholders will not be able to breathe fresh air if we don't have fresh air, right? And I know I'm a little bit far-fetched here, but I think consumers started grasping the bottom line here. And I hand back to Gabriela, because I'm sure you have something good to add.
Of that, I am sure, and we should never forget that we, as being citizens, hold the lever to the oxygen tank that actually supplies that oxygen to those people who are making those decisions. Gabriele.
Yeah. But I just wanted to reflect on this. I just also see the chats. And actually, it would also reflect on the very last chat from Larissa when it comes to incentives and support for companies. And when we would just talk about this issue, I was thinking that it wouldn't be me if I just wouldn't take the topic of circular economy at this point, and that also lead us basically to the incentives and reduction field, because obviously company as a CEO of a company, you have the choice to relocate your business to China, Vietnam, to Africa, or go back to Europe if you feel like doing so. However, if you also consider that we are in 2021, we are going towards a service economy, when services are more and more relevant and relevant for not only for businesses but for customers and in general. I would say that it's very crucial that companies get support from the states, especially when it comes to developing new and circular economic practices to reduce their CO2 emission and go towards a more complex solution, so to say, instead of looking at the quick wins, whether my HQ is in China or in Ukraine or in Hungary or wherever. So incentives, I myself find also very important, support from the states, and also in very specifically to support companies in the development of circular practices.
Joseph, any thoughts to that? You're on mute.
Okay.
There we go.
You brought up muted practices. One of the earlier questions by Faith that I saw up there is, can you use the blockchain? Because when I was thinking of the blockchain and technological solutions, I was thinking more in regulatory policy. I was thinking more about upstream, suppliers and sub-suppliers and so on. But Faith asked the question, what are my thoughts on blockchain track traced following through the individual item even after the consumer purchases it? And this is, I think, one of the things that we have argued, and we've been able to start investigating, is how to use blockchain technology for the circular economy. We have a number of papers that have been developed along that idea. And the idea here is, why not be able to trace the material or the product as it goes through the supply chain instead of the customer? Why can't the information be associated with that product as it goes along? Its location, how it's made, yada, yada, yada. That information can actually be stored at the molecular level, the very atomic level of the thing. That would be almost any product that's a durable product to be managed throughout the supply chain. And that is something we have proposed, that yes, after the sale, and the regulatory policy, and this gets into the whole regulatory policy issue, are things like electronics, the WE regulations, the RoHS regulations, especially the WE and take back regulations. I think that's the GDPR that you might have been talking about as well. That is a interesting regulation that has diffused internationally, except the United States. Broadly, it is. But China has its WE, Korea has its WE, Japan has its WE requirements. Every country that does business with the Europe has WE requirements. So the question now gets into is, are these due diligence laws going to be broadly applied internationally? And are they going to be spread out? But products flow internationally. Know where they are, know how old they are, is critical to product stewardship, whether the law exists or not. And I imagine that product stewardship isn't just going to be for an EU thing, that, manage products that stay within the EU, but anywhere in the world. And how do you trace them anywhere in the world? I don't want to say this technology will do that. I think there's the potential for this technology to help with that information to make circular economy more sustainable. By the way, circular economy and sustainability are not always synonymous, and I have a whole other paper on that issue too.
I could only agree with you.
I can agree.
Yeah, I think you will have violent agreement from the rest of the panelists here. There are some things that we do need to take into consideration, perhaps as we're reaching the witching hour here, maybe as a closing. We had the finish of COP26, what was it, about a month ago? And one of the big issues that I kept hearing through all the conversations that were tied to what happened, or better said, what didn't happen in Glasgow, was this idea of enforcement. And the question I would have to all of you as a closing is, looking at COP26, looking at what we will have next year at COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh, do we have the ability from a governance perspective to actually add teeth to some of those things that were discussed? We did see some tendencies in comparison to Paris, not nearly as much, but as it's never really a revolution, it is an evolution, and sometimes we take 2 steps back. What are your thoughts moving forward, looking at Sharm el Sheikh? Do we have a chance of making this a little bit more solid moving forward? Perhaps Gabriele, if you could start with you. Yep, you are on mute.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you. So I had some issues.
No worries.
Yeah, I mean, with the COPs, I don't know, I think it's the same with everybody here in this chat and in this online field right now, that we have all the COPs every year, new COP in different countries. Now because of COVID, we had online COPs, and I don't know. It's just another COP for me. I do agree that the COP in Paris that made some changes possible, but since then I do not see any difference between any of the different COPs, and I'm not sure what this COP will add to the never-ending lines of COP decisions. However, and it also refers back also what Joseph said, to this game theory approach, basically, that everybody should basically comply with the same rules. Otherwise, it will make the situation for some companies from specific countries much easier than for others, and obviously they will be free riders of the system. So it's an issue, sustainable supply chain, that should be considered at a higher level, at a WTO level or at a global level, UN level, wherever. But otherwise, we will have free riders everywhere at some point.
Well, I know this is not COP 26 and can be considered to be small fry in comparison, but we had a precedence here in Austria a few days ago where a tunnel that had been under discussion for a good 20 years, where all of the politicians considered it to be a done deal, based upon the actions primarily, I would say, from Extinction Rebellion and to a certain degree from Fridays for Future, and the fortunate situation for us to have a green environment minister who really means what she says. We were able to actually rescind that directive of building that tower because they realized, or they were able to successfully bring across the argumentation. If you have a problem with cars, if you build new roads, it doesn't solve the car problem. And so we need to be able to address that. And I think that we can look at things like this, these types of actions, or these types of progress, because it was a progress, as being an impetus of maybe how we take advantage of naming, shaming, and blaming, and actually going ahead and making these things happen. And so I guess playing the role of good cop, haha, bad pun. Sophia, perhaps if I could hand it over to you.
I can always be a good cop or a bad cop. You know, I'm a good partner in these things. But
Yeah, I know you are.
piggybacking, on what you just said, that's exactly, well, almost exactly what I wanted to share on what Gabriela said. I think the grassroots actions from the individual countries where they can change politicians in place, just like you said in Austria, it will be critical for the next COP to succeed. So we really need to use these 12 months, roughly 12 months. Time is ticking, very fast. We need to use these wisely wherever possible, where there's an election. I know, for instance, in my country, there will be an election as well, and in other countries as well across the globe. So we need to really step on as individuals, as citizens, and take those grassroots actions and get those going in our favor to make these legislations and governance happening. So that's what I would add here as a very bad cop.
May I just add something, Mike?
Sure,
Because
of course.
this part of the conversation leads us really to the big question: how do we initiate change, top down or bottom up? It's like a never ending story, actually.
Yeah,
There's
I was going to say something that came out of this. I have Gabriela's same cynicism or skepticism of these cops, and flying in from across the world on our big jets, hundreds of thousands of us to be able to talk about climate change. It's a bit hypocritical, but one of the things that I did see in my updates I get these little updates on news things, is that Joe Biden called up the premier of China to actually talk about climate change. And this is something they can agree upon. This is the top down portion of things. This is where you have two presidents of by far the leading emitters of carbon emissions actually seriously talking about this issue. If nothing else, this talk may lead to something. And this is where it begins. I still think we're still walking much too slowly, but at least we're walking. We're starting to crawl a little bit by talking about it among the two biggest emitters in the world. So I looked at this as the bright side of it. Of course, I have the cynical, skeptical. So if nothing else, it keeps the awareness up. It's not something that's forgotten, because if we stop doing this, it's going to be forgotten. And, we're going to have our own little conferences, academic conferences, or our little own groups. But this is something at least the news agencies have something to talk about on a slow news day. It brings up the awareness. That's the positive aspect. Does anything get done from it? A little bit. Mike, you mentioned a little bit here. I mean, just them talking to each other, two major presidents, leaders of major countries talking about it. First thing on their agenda was this. I think that's a major step forward. Anyway.
I would say anything that we have to talk about that forces us to avoid the subject of the pandemic is a vote. I could get a vote from my side, because I'm sick and tired of the subject, to be honest. We have reached our hour, and I would like to go ahead and bring us to a close. Gabriele, Sophia, Joseph, thank you very much for your participation. I appreciate all of you who felt empowered to inform the others from LinkedIn of how they can actually go ahead and partake in this live stream. I thank you very much for your initiative. That is not to be assumed, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. I love how the conversations, and I appreciate how the panelists also picked up on the conversation that were going on in the chat box. So that meant that we were able to go ahead and create a very interactive session. And for that, I'm also very thankful. And with that, I would like to just go ahead and announce a few different things very quickly. This would be tied to, of course, see if this works. Let's try this way. No, it doesn't work. I'm going to have to go another route. As we say, we love our technology. And here's another example of where we have to be very inventive. I wanted to go ahead and highlight a podcast from someone who is a very strong supporter of these live streams. That would be Artie Shaw, and her the actual podcast is called The Oblique Life, and it talks about a number of these subjects that we have been talking about today. And so if you're looking for an interesting slant on some of these subjects that we're covering, you might want to go ahead and check out The Oblique Life. And of course, as always, and I think this is a great segue with some of the things that we talked about today, especially our closing, our next live stream is titled Climate Guilt and Echo Shame. And we plan to perform a little bit more of a deeper dive as to what kind of power that we have as individuals in perhaps highlighting the greenwashing, making sure that those things that that companies are doing is made very visible, and that we are able to take charge and make a difference. And that will be taking place on the 4th of January. Again, thank you very much all for joining today. And I look forward to our next tete-a-tete. And again, I'd like to go ahead and thank my panelists one more time. Thanks again, and we'll be back soon. And see you then.